Welcome, everyone. We begin. My name is Jorge Villarreal, and I work at Mexico's Climate Initiative, or ICM, and we are the Climate Transparency Mexico's partner organization. It is my pleasure to moderate today's webinar on decarbonization, um, on decarbonizing the power sector in G20 countries in time of corona crisis. Most significant changes in 2019 and 2018 in the power electricity sector, and mostly good news. We will see it in a moment. This is the third and the final webinar on the occasion of the launch of the Climate Transparency Initiative Report 2020, the Climate Transparency Report 2020, which was published on November 18 this year. You can find it on Transparency webinar website, and we invite you to engage in the discussion on Twitter using the hashtag CT Report 2020. The report is the world's most comprehensive annual review of G20's climate action and their transition to a net zero emissions economy. Climate Transparency is a global partnership of 14 think tanks and NGOs that brings together experts from the majority of G20 countries. Today, our experts will describe the hugely significant changes on 2019 and 2018, discuss the need to decarbonize the power sectors of the G20 economies, the importance of the green recovery, and finally, the continuation of public investment on fossil fuels. I am pleased to introduce our speakers. Fabi Tumiwa from the Institute of Essential Service Reform in Indonesia, Jesse Burton from the Energy Systems Research Group at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. South Africa is a coal dominant, and also Indonesia, coal dominant of energy. And our third speaker from a country with renewable energy dominant, William Wills from Centro Clima in Brazil. After the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. Please type your questions in the chat during the webinar so our team can pass them to us. William will start us. William will start us of an overview of the G20. William, the floor is yours, please.
Thanks, Jorge. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is William from Centro Clima, COPI, at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. G20 emissions decreased in 2019, showing effects of climate policies at work. The power sector accounts for the highest share of G20 CO2 emissions, with 37.5%, but 2019 was a good year for power sector decarbonization, with CO2 emissions decreasing by 2.4%. 5 G20 members have set coal phase-out dates, and 13 countries have restricted coal financing domestically or abroad. The decarbonization of other sectors, such as transport, industry, and buildings, is contingent on a decarbonized power sector. Over the last 5 years, the emissions intensity of the power sector in the G20 has decreased by 10%, and the share of renewables in power generation grew by 20%, reflecting effective implementation of key policies, among other factors. Renewables now account for almost 27% of gross power generation in the G20, compared to 22% in 2014 and 19% in 2010. The growth of renewables has continued into 2020, and it is projected to increase 28% in this strange year that we are. In order to be in line with the 1.5-degree scenario, we need to phase out coal by 2040 and decarbonize the power sector until 2050. So, Fabi, could you please tell us how this is playing out in Indonesia?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Will. Indonesia remains a mixed bag, and on the one hand, Indonesia is the only country in the G20 in which the emission intensity of the power sector has increased in 2019. And rather than phasing out coal, Indonesia increased its coal capacity from 26 800 megawatt in 2018 to now around 27 and 100 gigawatt in 2019. And this is as a result of the 35 gigawatt fast track program announced in 2015. However, given the changing financing landscape of coal and concern over climate change and the risk of oversupply, in particular the largest system, which is Java-Bali system, due to the sluggish demand of electricity growth in the past 5 years, the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources is now considering to ending the construction of the new coal power plant in Java after the completion of the 35 gigawatt fast track program expected in 2025. Renewable is still compete with subsidized coal generation, which got loan guarantees, tax exemption, royalties, and also coal price cap in the past. And on the other hand, we see that now renewable energy costs have plummeted in the last decade and now outcompete even the cheapest coal power in many countries. And that's the realities now what we have seen in many countries. And recent bidding rounds of the solar project by state-owned utilities, PLN, in Indonesia have delivered lower price for solar than the new coal. And this should give PLN, our state-owned utilities, more confidence to build more utility scale project in the future to match government plan to add 5 gigawatt of solar in 2025. In addition, just early this year, the Indonesian government also announced a plan to substitute around 13 gigawatt of old thermal coal power plant that consists of coal, gas, and diesel power. I mean, old is the plant that more than 15 and 20 years old, with the renewables in the next 5 years. Jorge, back to you.
Thank you very much, Fabi. Another cold country is South Africa. Jesse, could you please share with us your thoughts on decarbonization progress in South Africa?
Sure, thanks, Jorge. Hello, all, greetings from Cape Town. In South Africa, as elsewhere in the G20, coal actually remains fundamental to the power sector, and in our case, in fact, accounting for more than 85% of electricity production. So South Africa is kind of an outlier. We're far more reliant on coal than others in the G20, but of course, this is an issue across all countries. Despite a very strong showing in the early part of the decade, no new renewable energy has been procured now for several years, partly for political reasons. But we are hopeful that the next bid window for the new renewable energy procurement round should open by January 2021. Kind of in opposition to this, the move towards renewables, there's about 6 gigawatts that'll become available in that bid round. There's actually no coal phase out plan or policy yet. And the integrated resource plan, that's the South African electricity plan, actually still includes 1.5 gigawatts of new coal power that's planned to come online before 2030. One really interesting thing about that is 2 of the most developed projects that are kind of expected as part of that bundle of new coal power. One of them has recently withdrawn their bid. It was a Korean and Japanese financed coal plant. So you can see that some of the trends around coal power finance in other countries are actually having effects in other G20 countries now. Of course, dealing with South Africa's reliance on coal in the power sector is a technical challenge, but there are really important political and economic challenges related to being very coal dependent in some of the regions. Mpumalanga is the region where we extract coal, and moving away from that reliance is of course essential for climate ambition. On a positive note, just transition is very high on the political agenda now in South Africa. So there's strong political support for pilot projects in the coal region to start thinking about planning and building institutions around economic diversification. And I can see that there's potentially a lot of learning between G20 countries about how this process can look. The final thing to note about South Africa, which is of course important across all the countries, is that there are many innovative funding models now being discussed. And in particular in South Africa, some of these are being discussed that will both accelerate the uptake of renewable energy, but are also looking at how to finance the early phase out of coal assets. So this is being explored in the USA, for example, but I think it's especially important in developing countries with high levels of coal in the power sector. We're going to need to find a solution to early closures if we're serious about 1.5 degrees and net zero by 2050. And highly exposed utilities like Eskom, PLN, and others is a really important part of climate action and just transition across these countries. It can enable accelerated transition to renewables in a fair way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessie. William, given that Brazil's power sector already relies on hydropower, what can we learn from Brazil about renewables?
Thanks for the question, Jorge. Well, on the one hand, Brazil decreased its emission intensity of the power sector by 47% between 2014 and 19. But a big part of this reduction was due to a higher than normal emissions intensity in 2013-14, which were very dry years. And we had to turn on all fossil fuel power plants at that time. So if you compare to now, we have a big decrease in emissions intensity. The share of renewables in power generation in Brazil is higher than 80%, mainly big hydropower plants with 63%, wind 9%, and biomass also 9%. It's the most of it. Solar is very competitive now and is growing very fast in this decade. But on the other hand, federal government plans to explore more natural gas and distribute it through pipelines in the Northeast region for industries and transportation. But to make it viable, it has been discussed to install natural gas power plants along the pipelines to guarantee a stable demand. So those thermal power plants won't generate power at peak time only, as most of the other natural gas power plants in Brazil. They would generate all the time to guarantee a stable demand. So this kind of policy would increase our emissions intensity of the power sector in Brazil and should be avoided. Okay. Jorge, please.
Thank you very much, William. Please let me recap some of the key messages we have heard from you, colleagues, and also described in the report. The good news is that for the first time, we are witnessing a decrease in the energy-related CO2 emissions and also of the emissions in the power sector. It's a very good news. Further good news, it shows that the climate policy works. Further good news is the power sector decarbonization help to decarbonize transport, buildings, and industry. And also coal, as we have heard, is and also described in the report, coal is going down and becoming less and less competitive. Yet, it's still strong in many countries such as Indonesia and South Africa. Renewables are increasing, but to meet Paris goal, we need to speed it up. Recovery packages in the G20 give too much support for fossil fuels, and there is a room to a change and keep the CO2 emissions decreasing trend. By the way, for further information on recovery packages, please take a look into the finance webinar held last week. It is available on the Climate Transparency YouTube channel. Thank you very much, Fabi, Jessie, and William. I am sure that you have some questions from the participants, and I am seeing now some on the chat. Let's take a look at the questions. Fabi, is the Indonesian government revising its coal expansion plans in the light of the difficulties to finance coal plants?
Yes, Jose, I can say that there's a new realization that the situation with coal financing now getting difficult. And I think the government and the utility realized that their traditional partners, because in the last 15 years, the Indonesian coal expansion is financed uh, by supporting by Japan, Korea, and China. And we have heard in the past few months that countries like Japan and China, as well as their financial institution, and also a number of technology provider, EPC companies, insurance from those countries, they all made quite a strong statement that they are no longer involved in the coal power plants in, um, in everywhere in the world, including in Indonesia. I think we have seen that number of company from those countries already um, um, withdraw from the number of projects that they have been working. And that realizations actually come to the Indonesian government. Although just last week, we heard from senior official from Ministry of Energy, which currently discuss about the new the PLN business plan for the next 10 years, saying that they are consider to reduce the coal capacity, the new coal capacity over the next 10 years. So this is for the first time, because the previous plan is actually, we see that the addition of coal, but the statement made that the capacity could be lower than before in the next 10 years. In addition, they would like to put more renewables. So we will not see this plan until early next year, but I think so far what I can see in Indonesia is quite a positive sign that the government is willing to push for more renewables and start to decrease the new coal capacity.
Thank you very much, Fabi. Related to it, Jesse, and South Africa is also a coal exporting country. How will it be affected by a decline in coal use worldwide?
Very good question, Jorge. So we're obviously waiting to see what happens at the end of this year, especially as companies start to report on their financial results. What's happened so far, there have been some retrenchments already announced at some smaller coal companies. For those who don't know, South Africa, we're sort of probably the fifth biggest exporter in the world, roughly. But half of the value of the industry comes from our export markets, primarily into India, but also Pakistan, South Korea, Vietnam. I think it's a really big risk around what's going to happen in the coal region. So it will have a relatively smaller impact on our own power sector for now, but it'll have very important just transition implications. And for many years, people have not believed that there was going to be a transition away from coal, that it would never happen. And I think what COVID-19 has done is really accelerate the transition I think it's brought it forward by about 5 years. And we can see that, coal use globally is going to fall about 7% this year. And all these important exporting countries, Russia, Indonesia, South Africa, Australia, are all competing for shrinking markets now. And without economic diversification strategies and worker transition plans for coal regions, it's going to basically be a socioeconomic nightmare, I think.
Thank you very much, Jesse. We have a very good question here. It says, Brazil model looks very interesting, and can we be adopted in Asian countries as well? What is the challenges for India to reducing coal dependency? Well, it's related to India question, but however, we can also relate it to, I'm not sure if anyone wants to jump in here, or William, you can also highlight the Brazil model And I will link it to a big question, a big discussion we have discussed around on Brazil. Do you consider big hydro renewable energy?
Well, thank you very much for this very controversial question. Well, you can't deny that, well, water comes from the water cycle, so it's renewable in this sense. We're not putting any fuel there, so it's renewable because every year, every time the rain comes and fill in the reservoirs and so on. So it is renewable, okay? But one can argue that it's not sustainable, especially if you do them in the Amazon region on, let's say, special regions for the environment. Okay, so you have to pay attention and do it the right way. That's how we consider it in our point of view. But this, I understand this is very controversial and it's a big discussion there. I cannot answer about India and Asian countries, but I think that our system is based in hydropower, and most of it was constructed in the 70s and 80s. So 30, 40 years ago, okay, maybe 50, even 50. And it depends on how the country, on the resources of the country, the water resources of the country. But what we can say now is that with wind and solar energy getting so much cheaper now, it is possible that other countries also increase a lot their share of renewables. They are very competitive. Here in Brazil, they are more competitive than hydro right now. And our remaining potential of hydro is mostly in the Amazon region, so they are growing very slow in the moment.
Thank you, William. Jesse, any thoughts on this question about India that you want to share with us?
Sure. So, of course, I'm clearly not an Indian researcher, but our partners, Terry, have told us a little bit about some of the issues that face them there. I think there's two questions. There's energy system questions. So how do you phase out coal in a country that uses 220 gigawatts of installed capacity, and what do you replace that with and over what timeline? And beyond the power sector, you know, quite a lot of Indian coal use is also for steel, for example, sponge iron, and replacing that needs different kinds of technological pathways. The other part of that is, of course, that India's one of the largest coal producers in the world. So although they import a lot, they also produce their own. And there's complex sets of cross-subsidies, including, for example, on the railways. So the Indian railways are cross-subsidized by the Coal India Limited transport of coal. Coal India Limited themselves are very important in their own regions. They build roads, they build schools. Some estimates are that they support about 15 million people. And they are now just starting their research outfits in India that are just starting to look at these questions. So how dependent are some of the districts? How will it look to phase out coal? They have a very large informal coal mining sector. So it's not like here where our miners are relatively highly skilled and could potentially be moved into other sectors. There aren't necessarily new sectors to move people into yet. There's so much churn and economic development happening that you have to think about that very carefully. So India, I think, is getting there, but not yet. And for them, there'll also be questions about what do they replace it with. Obviously, renewables are very competitive now, especially solar. But you can't only have solar. You need to have a kind of portfolio of different supply options. Thanks.
Thanks, Jesse. Here is another question from Francisco Gomez. He says, this week I watched Bloomberg's Sustainable Business Summit. They came up with a concept that I loved, impact-adjusted profits, to account for negative externalities. What do you make of it? Any thoughts, colleagues? Well, I am sure that we can come with this question on brief description by email. I am sure also that this impact-adjusted profit, we don't know still what does stand for this concept, but negative externalities accounting is quite relevant in regard of the energy just transition discussions. Yeah, and certainly for coal and for the rest of fossil fuels, but it is needed to take a look in that way. And I am sure that we will take a close look into this concept, impact adjusted profit. Thank you very much, Francisco, for your question. I think that we are about the time. If there is no another comment from our colleagues, I am sure that we can close this webinar. Thank you very much for participating, to all of the audience and also our colleagues, our experts. We will answer by email these and the other questions we didn't get into the session. This is the third and final webinar introducing the findings of the Climate Transparency Report 2020. Recordings of all webinars are available on the Climate Transparency YouTube channel. Once again, thank you very much for your participation. Enjoy the rest of the days and evening, and stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.